Good afternoon. Welcome to Education Today. I'm your host, Kitty Kelly Epstein, and with me today is my co-host, Jaron Epstein, and a very exciting guest that we're going to talk to in just a minute. I just wanted to endorse something that was just said on the station about why people need to listen and give to KPFA. So there's so much going on in the world, and the sources of any accurate information in the United States are very, very small. And it's so confusing if you listen to mainstream media and really any media besides KPFA, to be honest, about what's happening with Iran, who's on which side, who are the good guys and the bad guys, and why is it all happening. And it's scary to everybody. And also we need to understand it so we can do something about it. So I really encourage my friends, I've been doing this more lately, to listen to Democracy Now!, which is one really good source of getting more sides to the issues. And then, following the people that are reporting from around the world, like Al Jazeera and some other publication stuff that comes out on Instagram and so on. And KPFA, because you can find out more what is being said by various sides on an issue if you listen to KPFA. So I know everybody's wanting to be informed right now. Just want to encourage people that, KPFA is one of the few places where you can actually get informed. So we have with us today, speaking of current issues that we're all concerned about, many of our listeners are very concerned about what's happening in Cuba and have been for years, really, because the U.S. treatment of Cuba, Cuba has done amazing things in terms of literacy, standard of life, health care, and many other things. And in spite of that, because our government didn't like the government that the Cuban people chose when they had a revolution, we have had a boycott and blockade, and that has not only been Republicans, that has also been Democrats. So that's been a bad situation. And then more recently, the current administration has gone even further in threatening Cuba and depriving them of things that they needed to get. So we have with us today a guest who was in Cuba recently and has spent a lot of time thinking about these issues and these solidarity issues. And so, Marcus, I want to welcome you to Education Today and give you a little bit more of an introduction. Marcus lives in Columbus, Ohio. He is a sponsor of a program called Struggle 4 on Twitch TV. And later on in the program, I'm going to ask him to give us more direct instructions about how you all can listen to it. He's a left military veteran. He does Cuba solidarity work, and he also does broadcasting. And he was in Cuba very recently during the blackout. So welcome to Education Today, Marcus.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and we're so looking forward to hearing what you have to say about some of these things. So one thing that everybody knows happened recently is that there was a blackout in Cuba, and we all saw the blackout. That's all we saw, and felt worried and concerned about people being in a blackout. So I wonder if you could tell us what that was like and how people reacted to it.
Yeah, so Cuba and the governments, they've had to ration, the oil because of the, now increase of the blockade that's been, going on for over 6 decades. And so at this point, most of Cuba has been going through rolling blackouts for over a year, in which case there's scheduled times, and now it's down to like 3 to 4 hours. However, there are major blackouts where basically the whole grid just collapsed, and that had happened on one of the nights that we were there. And it is a very eerie thing. I think most Americans can identify we're on maybe natural disasters, or people in where hurricanes are. These things can happen, but people in Cuba have adapted and adjusted, and that's where I think for us visitors, it was much more stark because they had already grown accustomed to some of these things. But everything, for the most part, pitch black. No street lights or anything like that. So like cars moving around, are like little suns of light moving across the street. And then as soon as they turn a corner, it's pitch black again. But through all that, you got, people playing dominoes, using batteries to play music and dance in the street. There's people that we saw using flashlights to light up the street and play baseball through the night. So, yeah, for us, and it was a very stark thing, but for the Cuban people that we saw, they found, life goes on. But I think the thing that's probably the most stark thing that we don't see is that in the hospitals where these grid shortages, you've got people who are pumping the chests or, the bags of people on respirators. This is where when the grid goes down, then there's a whole bunch of emergency services that need to react to keep people alive who need electricity to stay alive.
Wow.
So that was all occurring that that
Wow.
first night we were there.
Wow. And that's, wow, so hard and I know how hard the Cuban people work on the health care of everybody. So to have to deal with that is awful. And at the same time, it's inspiring to hear that people who were able to move around weren't hiding in their houses. They were playing dominoes and dancing and stuff like that. I mean, that's pretty cool. I think a lot of us have heard that the Cubans are resilient, but that's kind of beyond over the top in resilience. It seems like.
Yeah, and that's something that the more you learn about, the Cuban people is the creativity, and kind of how they describe it. But um, yeah, it's, and I think that's something that we, as all of us are kind of looking forward to whatever's coming next in our futures, recognizing that, human beings, music and culture and all these things, it gets us through, some of the tough times, and not so much it's a waste of time when things are hard. And so that's where, and that's where you got to keep yourself busy with the electricity gone. Sitting around, would probably drive people crazy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. And that's part of the beauty of Cuban culture, I think, which we get sometimes to get some bit of in the U.S. when people come or we get to hear the music and see what's happening, the art and stuff. It's part of the beauty of Cuban culture. So Jaron has a question for you also.
Hey, happy to have you on here about all the great work that you've been doing. One of the things I'm really curious is the students at the university and just with the energy crisis, making it hard to even hold classes. Just wondering what are the students saying? How do they feel? As far as having to say how things are going or being handled during a crisis like this.
yeah, so the students and university students in Cuba have, a very, very rich history, and not unlike the students in the United States. You think of, just pushing social and cultural issues into just a more correct and moral position, especially in the anti-war aspects of things. But Cuban students at the university have, even being a part of the revolution until now and helping, being integrated with the structure of any support of any crisis. But like you said, everything it affects every group of the public in a different way. And with the students, they've essentially kind of had to go back to like a COVID mode because students can't make it. They can't travel. There's not enough gas to get to pass up the cars or buses so that students can travel to campuses and go to class. So they've had to go to remote learning, like they did during COVID. But all these things, come to be because they consolidate with the students. So I was able to meet with the the student president and the faculty, like the faculty liaison for the student government, and the university actually, part of their governing body is the student organization. It's not, this is where it's a stark difference in U.S. universities, where the student groups are just, they're more for the pleasure of the students. They don't actually get a say into how the university is run.
Right.
I think even like the funding for Israel, is a good example for that. But in Cuba, there's just like more democracy that spreads down to the university level, where the student government is a legitimate authority in the university system. There's the governing bodies for all the universities within our country, and it's mostly just a group of adults, right, that aren't students whatsoever.
Right.
But when Cuba, the students are a part of that governing body. They need to be consulted for all changes, whether it's the times of classes, buildings of new dormitories, and how do they respond to the crisis. So one of the things that the students initiated, or at least they started discussing, was, while being remote, professors should also go out into Cuba, go out outside of Havana, or at least wherever universities are, and they started doing public lectures while they're doing their online classes. And so now, anybody that is, out of work because they can't work, they can go to some of these community, just town hall type of things and engage in higher education completely free. And this is just a way that the students had come up with something to really help the Cuban population try and get through these hard times, and in a way that's really, enriching, especially educationally.
Right. Definitely. I mean, that was a lot that you just shared, and I think you said going back to what it was like during COVID, and just thinking about how how hard it was for some of our kids here with lack of technology and access, not even doing stuff like that here, where we have public access, we have radio, we have TV channels of the school district and different things like that weren't even being used to try to teach kids during that time. So I think it's definitely a contrast, and I think that was definitely saying a lot, that they're actually trying to reach people and make it accessible to everybody. What do you think, just in terms of the living conditions, and for people? Do people have access to laptop? They make sure people have the means to be able to log on to to be able to access this kind of stuff. What do you think? How does that look for students?
Yeah, no, and you make a very great point, is that, as far as what the average, student in the United States has access to the Cuban student. And this is where community really is much deeper and more engaged. And, I think a lot of Americans are talking about, like, with times when we used to grow up, and the whole neighborhood knew each other a little bit more, and all this type of stuff.
Right.
Cuba has to survive off those community connections. And so the ability to spread the communication, everything like that, it does just rely on people knowing people, where they live, live, where they grew up, who their parents are. So, right, so you can actually get the message spread quickly, but you might not have the technology there. And that's where too is as far as like the student groups, a lot of the work and coordination has to get it goes into finding who in the class doesn't have a laptop, who can they get to who does have a laptop, where can they meet in the middle somewhere, can they go to is there a library, so this is where the fact that Cuba has a substantial educational model, for the whole island to begin with, even if if you go to the University of Havana but you live on the other side of the island, there's other school, there's other educational sites where you can, connect still. So that's basically how they do it. But it is all of this, everything that is made much harder because of the blockade. They have less access to things. That it's not just that the power goes out and the laptop runs out of electricity, right? You might not have a laptop, and so they get through this through community, and really be neighborly. That might be the best way to explain it.
Thank you for that explanation. That really does speak to the power of community and the fact that we part of the movement in the U.S. has to be trying to establish community because we need each other for a lot of things too, even though we're not in the kind of, we haven't been put under blockade because, we're the big imperialist power, but that speaking to community is wonderful. And one more thing about the education before I ask you another question is I think a lot of people know, but Cuba has a higher literacy rate than the United States. I know it's hard for people to really, but Cuba has a 99% literacy rate, and the U.S. is something like 70-something. So with all the money that there is in the U.S., somehow the kind of systems that Marcus is talking about has allowed Cuba to have a higher literacy rate and a wonderful literacy campaign. And there are a couple of really good books about it. Hope if people are interested in Cuba. There's one called Children of Che. There's one called Children of the Revolution that are really interesting about their literacy campaign. So I wanted to ask you about another question, which is astonishing to everybody in the U.S., which is that Cubans have a slightly longer life expectancy than Americans. So Cuban life expectancy is like 79 and U.S. life expectancy is 78. And also there's a racial disparity in life expectancy in the U.S. African American people live on average 4 years less than white Americans, which all the underlying things that lead to that are a topic of another show, but that's the reality. And Cuba's one place where there's almost no disparity racially in the life expectancy. So I wonder if you could tell us, there have to be a lot of things that go into the reality of Cuba having a longer life expectancy, in spite of the conditions that they faced with the blockade from the U.S. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I think maybe a good connector between education and healthcare is the education is completely free. The literacy rate is high. Education across the board is completely free up until as many PhDs as you qualify to learn. Cuba would pay for it.
So you don't pay to get a PhD if you have the qualifications to study for a doctorate. You can study for a doctorate without any money.
As long as you qualify to study that program, as long as you did 101, you get to do 102, and then it's completely paid for.
Wow.
And that's what, especially you could stack as many PhDs as if you just continue learning, they'll continue paying. So when it comes to the medical program, this is something where all over the world people come to Cuba to study at this international school, the International Latin American School of Medicine, and so they have a very robust medical system that really, once again, starts at the community level. there is, I I mean, I can only compare it to, imagine if like the public school system in the United States had a healthcare system where like the teachers, the doctors, they have these community clinics that have a range of medical practices within the community clinic that basically from pregnant people and pregnancies to elder care, and everything in between. And these community clinics are really, the first line of I want to say defense, but it is really like the one of the abilities that allows people to really live their lives. This is the preventative care that it does keeps people from having serious illnesses. Where in the United States, we know it's the complete opposite. People will put off going to the doctor so long until you're unable to work, and then you have to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
So it's completely reversed, and so this is one of the things that allows Cuba to be more efficient is just focusing on preventative care. But then there is more of the amazing thing where this is a focus. There's a rich culture of scientific endeavor in Cuba, and so when it comes to their biomedical research, they've been able to develop Alzheimer's remedies that basically stops degeneration. And this is now being going through their testing. The I forget what it's called. But they're going through the tests in Canada, the trials in Canada right now. They've got care for diabetes that prevents people from needing amputations, and there's thousands and thousands of Americans who have amputations due to diabetic concerns and complications every year. Thousands and thousands of Americans. This could be, put down into single digits, really.
Wow.
So there's also a lung cancer vaccine. So with Cuba, it is I think a focus on the things that really matter, like education and healthcare, and going at it scientifically and efficiently. Americans should know it's actually cheaper if you get to go to the doctor earlier and more often. And that's just what they do. That's what the science says, and that's how they treat people. And that allows for these disparities between the nation that's the United States and the country that they are blockading from the rest of the world. Is that focus on kind of just the correct answer and not the profitable answer?
Wow. So they develop all those systems even while blockading, and new medicines too, right? They develop new medicines with what they have in Cuba.
Yes. And this is in developing it under blockade, and these are things that the American public are being denied access to as well. There's Americans with Alzheimer's, Cuba can help. Americans with diabetes, Cuba can help. Okay, Americans with lung cancer, Cuba can help. These are all things that are not only very difficult to achieve under this blockade, but are now just being denied to the American public and so much of the rest of the world.
Wow.
During COVID, they actually developed 5 different COVID vaccines, which to lay people, 5 different vaccines, is useful for the different materials that might be used in the vaccines. There might be different reactions for certain other people, that on disabilities to certain vaccines. There might be religious practices that stop. So they made 5 different were able to develop 5 different COVID vaccines, and they needed an international effort to donate syringes, because syringes are something that are basically made. U.S. components are utilized to make almost all syringes across the world. So this is one thing where it's very, very difficult just for them to get syringes. So at the point in time in COVID where basically everybody on the island needed a syringe. They, there had to be a global effort to donate just the syringes. Everything else they could do,
Wow.
but there be stopped, just because of the blockade on those aspects.
Wow. That's such a telling example. We only have a couple minutes left, and I know Jaron has questions for you about your own how people can hear you, I guess. So, Jaron?
Yeah, so for people that are listening, especially for young people who want to do more than just reading about this, how can they support people in Cuba? Where can they find your show and get up to date about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so for the support for people in Cuba, I think that's it. This is something that I think across the board, it's exciting seeing so many people step up and want to help and even just learn about Cuba and the Cuban people and what they've been able to accomplish. So, I'm a part of the U.S. Hands Off Cuba Committee. People can go to ushandsofcubacommittee.com. DSA is highly engaged, so people can be, if you're a DSA member, they got a Cuba committee. There's the National Network on Cuba, the NNOC. People can engage in that. There are a myriad of organizations, not just tourists, that helps with medical bags. And so there's a list in Code Pink, that's, that was, part of the major organizers of the trip that we went on. So really, and if there's nothing around you, you can just, come up with a group on your own. But if people want to find me, it's on twitch.tv/struggle_ and the number 4, struggle _4. But it's a little bit of kind of like, it's like talk radio, except online on the Twitch channel. So twitch.tv/struggle _4 is where you can find us.
We will write it down on. I'll put it on my Facebook page, and we'll put it on our notes for the show. Thank you for that information, because I know people are going to want to follow you. Jaron, you want to close this out?
Sure. Thank you. You've been listening to Education Today. Thank you to my co-host, Kitty Kelly Epstein. Thank you to our guest today, Marcus. Thank you to our board operator, Kirsten Thomas. Thank you to the KPFA staff and to our listeners. We'll be with you again next Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. Thank you. See you then.
Real change starts with how we think and how we learn. On Choose to Be Curious, wonder is more than a question. It's a tool for creativity, connection, and possibility. On Education Today, you hear the voices of students, teachers, and community activists fighting for schools that truly serve us all. Together, these shows remind us curiosity fuels knowledge, and knowledge fuels change. KPFA, culture that empowers, voices you won't hear anywhere else.
This is KPFA, the tiny station that refuses to shut up. 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online at kpfa.org.